In this lecture for History 370, Modern East Asia, we will be examining Section 6, Japan's Empire in Korea. Our objectives for this section are to understand the nature of the Japanese colonial state and how its policies changed over time, to understand how Koreans responded to the hardships and opportunities brought on by the colonial experience, and to understand how the differences in these responses help lead to deep divisions between Koreans. I think that key to understanding Japan's colonial project in Korea is to understand the nature of the colonial government it established in Korea. So you may recall that when Japan was colonizing Korea, they had, before annexation, something called a resident general, and the first one was Ito Hirobumi, who An Chungun killed. After annexation, they replaced the position of resident general with governor general, and they referred to their government as the government general. Now, you may recall Ito Hirobumi was a civilian official. Ito Hirobumi, you may remember the pictures of him were generally not in military garb, and he was often understood to be part of the more civilian-oriented wing of the Japanese government, and was often at odds with those Japanese who wanted to take a more military view of things. With the annexation of Korea, you have the establishment of this new Japanese government general, in which is headed by governor generals. All of them, every single governor general, had served in the military. Right? Every single one of them had served in the military. All except for one had served in the Navy. So that tells us something about how Japan viewed Korea, right? It tells us something very important about how Japan viewed Korea. For the Japanese government, Korea's primary importance was strategic. Its primary importance was in regards to Japan's security. So that's why they put military men in charge, right? All the men who serve as governor generals, the Japanese head of the Japanese colonial government in Korea, were all soldiers, were all in the military. Only one was not in the army, he was in the Navy. As an aside, the Navy was considered more liberal, the army more conservative. The governor generals were also appointed directly by the emperor and were therefore responsible only to the emperor. Japan, you may recall, was a democracy with what's called a diet, which is kind of like a congress. The governor generals were not responsible to the diet. They were not responsible to the prime minister of Japan. They were responsible directly to the emperor. So that meant that these were very high-ranking officials who were ultimately not responsible to any democratic body, but directly to the emperor himself. They ran a government, right? The governor generals ran a government general that was very centralized, and that therefore appointed local officials down to the village level, right? So you have this government that it's not a federal system like we might be used to in the United States, where you have a federal government, a state government, a local government. Everything, provincial, state, local, is all based around the central government. And the centralized government is going to be able to expand down all the way into the villages to collect taxes, to assign labor duties, and that sort of thing. All of this is enforced by powerful police force with summary powers. What are summary powers? Basically, for minor crimes, the police officer would not simply arrest you, but could actually judge your case right then and there. Right? So think about this, right? If you get a traffic ticket or something like that, you have the right to appeal it generally, for example. Here, the policeman would just you would just have to pay the policeman right then and there, or the policeman also had a right to have you flogged, even for relatively minor crimes. You could be whipped, essentially. And the police could do this without any recourse to a judge, right? So this gives the police a lot of power, because while there are judges for more serious crimes, for more minor crimes, the police officers could themselves act, in a sense, as judge, jury, and executioner, not killing you, but punishing you with fines, and in the early period, even with beatings. The goal of this Japanese government general was to bring massive, rapid political, economic, and social change in order to modernize Korea. Right? In order to modernize Korea. However, principally out of the interests of the Japanese state. Right, so Japan is going to has as its duty the modernization of Korea, something many Koreans wanted. But here's the thing: Korea is going to be modernized in the interests, according to the interests of the Japanese state. Remember, that was a point of conflict with Ito Hirobumi. Ito Hirobumi did want to help Korea to modernize, but he also wanted it to benefit Japan. And so Korean interests were sacrificed to meet the needs of the Japanese, and so Koreans resisted. Well, now you have a government, Japanese colonial government, much more powerful than what Ito had. Right? This government is going to have the power to try and bring this massive, rapid political, economic, and social change to Korea, whether the Koreans want to or not. And they oftentimes will resist because it's being done in the interests of Japan. So it would now be helpful to look more deeply at what I mean by the interests of Japan, as I already alluded to by the fact that all the heads of the Governor General were military men. Strategic interests were paramount. The interests of Japanese security were paramount. They were then followed by economic interests. Japan hoped to extract resources from Korea, right? Hoped to extract resources from Korea, particularly cheap food. And even before the annexation of Japan, this is something that the Japanese were really interested in. And one thing, if you want to understand Japanese actions during this time period, always think of Japan not feeling like it has enough resources, and especially in regards to food, right? There's this understanding that if Japan was to be cut off and to have to rely on its own resources, the resources of the islands alone, then the Japanese people might starve. There just wouldn't be enough food. And that's important to think about, that, that there's this overriding concern. We may not have enough food. So they were looking to Korea as a place where they could get resources, particularly in terms of food. Increasingly, as we'll note, Korea will be a place for Japanese investment, especially in industry, right? Especially as Japan becomes wealthier, wages go up, and people who run factories would like to have cheaper wages, lower wages, so they will start building factories in Korea. So Korea will also be a source of labor and of manufactured goods. They are also hoping that Korea will serve as markets, right? They're making things in Japan, or Japanese-owned factories are making things in Korea. They want Koreans to buy their stuff. And also, there is this hope that as the Japanese population continues to expand, Japanese can go settle in Korea. And while Japan and Korea are different countries, they are similar in that they're both mountainous, they are along the same rough latitude, and they both, especially in southern Korea, tend to focus on rice agriculture. So farmers from Japan could move to Korea and engage in rice agriculture. They knew how to do that. And finally, there was this understanding that Japan had come to civilize Korea, to modernize Korea. Now that comes last, that's mostly for propaganda, but it does exist to a certain extent, because after all, for Korea to serve Japan's strategic interests and its economic interests, Korea needs to become modern, right? Korea needs to become modern. A modern Korea will be better able to produce and extract resources. Its people will be wealthier and they can buy stuff, and it will make a nicer place for Japanese to live when they immigrate there. During this time period, Korea did not have the same population density Japan did, so there was this idea that Japanese people could immigrate to Korea and find land there. Now, Japan followed in Korea a policy of assimilation. In assimilation, there's this idea that Koreans are to become like Japanese, and Korea is to become and remain an integral part of Japan. So to give you an example, the United States, from the very beginning actually of coming into the Philippines, understood that it would one day leave the Philippines. Right? There was this, the American government said, we're not going to be here forever, and we kept that promise. Japan was much less willing to do that. Their understanding and the government was that Korea was to become and remain an integral part of Japan, and therefore Koreans should become more like Japanese. And this makes sense logically, because after all, had not the Japanese been the first Asians to successfully modernize? right? Koreans should therefore imitate them. And there were, remember, a lot of Koreans who said we need to be more like the Japanese. So Japan followed this policy of assimilation. These Koreans need to become more like the Japanese. Koreans had cultural issues, social issues that prevented them from becoming modern. The Japanese had overcome social and cultural issues in order to become modern. So the Koreans need to imitate the Japanese, be like the Japanese. Now, in practice, what this meant was that Koreans were to become enough like the Japanese to make it easier for the Japanese to govern them and extract the labor and resources from the Koreans. So, for example, Koreans would be expected to learn Japanese language. During World War II, they would even be under pressure not only to speak it publicly, but to speak it at home. Koreans would also be expected later on during World War II to change their names to Japanese names. You've seen in this class already that Koreans and Japanese have very different names. So there's this understanding that Koreans need to become like the Japanese in order to become modern, because Japanese have been the first Asians to become modern. But in practice, this meant focusing just on making it easier for the Japanese to govern Koreans. Koreans are a lot easier to govern when they accept Japanese culture and Japanese language, right? And it's much easier to extract labor when they speak Japanese and to get them to extract resources and so on. But Koreans are never, ever, it would seem, good enough from the Japanese perspective to be given equal treatment to Japanese, right? Even though the Koreans are told to be like Japanese and to increasingly to do the duties as if they were Japanese, they're never allowed to become Japanese enough to threaten Japanese interests, right? So Koreans, for example, are never given the right to vote. They're promised the right to vote in like 1945 when the war is almost over in order to get them to support the war, but they're never given the right to vote in any effective way because that might threaten Japanese interests. So there's this promise that, hey, if you Koreans become like us Japanese, you'll become modern and you'll get equal rights and so forth, but it never materializes, right? Koreans are always just not similar enough to the Japanese to get their equal rights. However, they are expected to still sacrifice for the good of the Japanese Empire, of which Korea is now a part. And to give you a sense of this, from 1910 to 1919, Koreans could be flogged for crimes committed in Korea. Japanese who committed those same crimes could not be flogged, right? So this is an example of what I mean, where you have this kind of inequality, and it was basically argued by the government, well, Koreans are not sophisticated enough to really understand prison. They're lazy because they're not modern, and so they wouldn't really understand prison because you send them to prison, they're like, hey, this is great, I don't have to do anything. Whereas our Japanese people, we're modern, we work hard, we understand that prison is a bad thing, so you don't need to beat us, you just send us to prison for a short time. But oftentimes they didn't even get that. So you've got this basic inequality and this basic tension where Koreans are told you need to become like the Japanese, but they're just never quite good enough to get the rights. They do have to do the same duties as Japanese people, they do have to pay their taxes and so forth, but they never get the rights. What's interesting about this is that the Japanese developed this kind of self-image of themselves as benevolent fathers, right? We're these good benevolent fathers taking care of our Korean children. And this is, again, I think kind of problematic because I would argue that Koreans are treated more like farm animals than children, right? When you take care of a child, right, if you're a parent, you want your child to develop so that one day they can kind of take care of themselves, right? And you want to kind of direct them in accordance to their own interests. For example, my children have musical talent and I don't. I don't say, well, you can't study music, you need to study history because that's what I study. I say, no, you should study music, and I support them in doing that because that's helping them to develop. In contrast, if you have a farm animal, you take care of your farm animal so it can serve you, right? You take care of your draft horse or your ox or your chickens or your pigs in such a way that you can profit from them. Of course, it's good for a pig or a horse to be healthy, but I keep them healthy to serve me, not to serve them. And I would argue that the Japanese perspective, and this is true basically of any colonial powers, this is why you do not want to be a colony, and it's important for us to understand this, to understand why there was so much resistance. If you're a colony, you're more like a farm animal. You're treated well so you can work well. right? You're educated, for example, only to not for your good, not so you can become a self-actualized person, but so you can better serve the interests of the colonial power. And I'll go more into detail with this issue of education later, right? And this is why there's going to be such Korean resistance, because they're essentially treated not as children, and even that's not that great, right? We're adults, we don't need to be treated like children, but they're treated as farm animals. When there's colonial policies that are meant to help them to become educated, to become healthy, but this is so they can better serve their colonial masters, not so they can act in their own interest and the interest of Korea, right? So Korea will be developed in terms of Japanese interests. So needless to say, perhaps, but I'm still going to say it to be clear, assimilation does not work very well, right? The whole policy of trying to assimilate Koreans does not work well because they're expected to give up their culture, their identity, their language, in a sense, their entire civilization, but they're not really given much in return, right? Even Koreans who do learn Japanese, who adopt Japanese names and so forth, often do not do all that well, particularly in the job market. The reason for that is because Korea is treated as a settler colony, right? As I mentioned previously, the population in Japan is going up. There's population pressure in Japan. The Japanese government is looking for an outlet, and so it wants to encourage people to emigrate from Japan, to immigrate to new countries, to relieve that Japanese population pressure. So Japanese are encouraged to settle in Korea, right? Japanese are encouraged to settle in Korea. So, for example, basically the Japanese government in Korea will seize a huge amount of land from the Koreans and make that land available to the Japanese settlers. Now, there were some Japanese farmers who settled in Korea, but a lot of Japanese people settled in Korea and lived in the cities. In fact, Japanese people, which would number in the millions in Korea, would constitute an average of 25% of the urban population. That's huge. And that's the most modern part of Korea, right? Typically, modernization happens first in cities. So you have a lot of Japanese people in Korea, and you have them in control of the most important parts of Korea, in a sense, in terms of modernity. And they are going to pressure the government to prioritize their interests. For example, one reason why the Japanese government is not interested in employing Koreans at the highest levels is because Japanese people in Korea want those jobs. And the Japanese government doesn't want Koreans to get too educated because then they would compete with Japanese people for those jobs. So this is why assimilation does not work well. Right? Koreans are expected to give up everything, but are typically not given much in return. Right? And even when the Japanese government wants to follow this assimilation policy, they're pressured by Japanese people to not follow the policy because that would mean allowing Koreans to compete with Japanese people for jobs and things like that. So I've tried here to emphasize how Japanese people don't just stay in Japan. One thing about this course, because we're focusing on all of modern East Asia, I want to emphasize how there's movement among Asian people. And that's something that the Japanese Empire is going to make possible, and we're going to look at some examples of that. For now, though, I want us to focus on this idea of how this was a settler colony, which Japan was going to try and make an integral part of the empire, never to leave. And in this way, it was dissimilar from other empires, right? So to give you an example, in 1910, Japan had 10,000 officials in Korea. By 1937, they had 87,000, the vast majority of which were Japanese. Now, what's striking about this is that Britain had as many personnel in India as Japanese had in Korea. But India had 20 times the population of Korea. What that means is that on a per capita population basis, there were a lot more Japanese officials than there were in, say, a colony like India for Britain. And this shows just how deep the Japanese were committed to holding on to Korea and how deep their government penetrated into Korea. And this is key to them trying to make Korea into this modern, country from which they could extract resources and strengthen their empire, it's also important for us to understand why there's going to be so much bitterness against the Japanese, because Koreans felt the Japanese colonial empire even more deeply than, say, Indians, right? There were Indians who had never seen a British person before, for example, because there were not that many British people in India. However, all Koreans, for the most part, the vast majority of Koreans, I should say, would have met a Japanese person and would have been meant to feel like a foreigner in their own country, a second-class citizen in their own country. We have to understand that Koreans, many Koreans, I should say, resisted colonization fiercely. We already have talked about that, how you had these righteous armies, for example, that were fighting aggressively against the Japanese. Now, there were Koreans that would work with the Japanese, especially in the police force. That was one area where Koreans, because of the importance of their Korean language skills, could rise, right? The police have to do a lot with the population, so that was they need to speak Korean, so that was one area where Koreans could rise. And so there are Koreans who will work with the Japanese, but for most Koreans, they did not like having the Japanese in charge. They did not like having them around. They had historically seen the Japanese as coming from an inferior civilization and were horrified that the Japanese were taking over. And even though there were Koreans willing to work with the Japanese, the Japanese were only able to stay in power through controlling violence, through controlling force. So we have to understand, this was not something that most Koreans liked. There were Koreans who cooperated, or what we can say collaborated, but most Koreans did not want the Japanese around. Now, so the Japanese had to maintain power by force. So one thing I like to point out was not only did police wear swords, school teachers wore swords. The man in that picture there is not a police officer. That is a teacher, right? So it was emphasized who was in charge and why they were in charge, right? Koreans, for the most part, want to be independent. They want their country back. Japan can only stay in force by controlling violence. And so most of the people who collaborate with the Japanese are ones who the Japanese can use to help them control Korea through violence, right? This is like the police, like I said, are the one area where the Japanese are really willing to allow Koreans to act because they need their help, right? They're going to continuously expand and keep at approximate parity the number of Korean police, right? So they're going to have 6,000 police in 1910. By 1922, they have 20,000, of which half are Korean. By 1941, they have 60,000, of which half are Korean. So they keep the percentage about the same while increasing the number. And as I said earlier, these police officers, there's just a lot of them, and they have a lot of duties. For example, the police could come inside your house to see if your bathrooms were meeting the correct sanitation rules, right? This is something the police could do, right? And if your house was not up to the standard of cleanliness, they could fine you, and they could post like a sign outside your door telling everyone in the neighborhood that your house was dirty. And like I said, the police could fine you, and even though they weren't supposed to do this, they could beat you, and there wasn't really much you could do about it. And I think it's interesting, like I said, you can see how Japan is running this colony to stay in charge. They have to they have to focus on this issue of force. And that's why this is the one area where they're willing to employ lots of Koreans, because they need people who can speak Korean in order to control the population. Now, one thing you will sometimes hear the apologists of imperialism, particularly Japanese imperialism, say is, well, we brought modernity, we brought schools, and things like that. Now, it is true that the Japanese government did institute compulsory education, similar to what they had done in Japan. However, it's not like they went around building schools for the Koreans. The Koreans were expected to build the schools themselves. The resources for this infrastructure came from the colony. And this isn't just Japan, this is most empires. They weren't going to be giving these things away as charity. The resources were expected to come from within the colony itself. And while Koreans were essentially expected to pay for the schools, the education focused primarily on the Japanese language, on morality, which meant being loyal and obedient to the empire, and on vocational training, so learning practical skills, learning, for example, how to run a train, but not how to manage a business, right? A person might learn to be a train conductor or to work in a factory, but they would not be expected to become a business manager. So the Japanese education system in Korea, which Koreans were expected to pay for, wanted Koreans to serve in lower offices and lower jobs in areas where Korean language was needed, especially the police, as I stated before, to be loyal to the empire and not to have any sort of education that would allow them to compete with the Japanese, right? They want the Koreans to serve in lower offices, right? Lower jobs. They do not want them to be white-collar workers. They want them to be blue-collar workers who are loyal and who speak Japanese, right? They don't want education that will make Koreans able to rebel or question the government. They want education that will make Koreans do what the government wants. And one thing I think is fascinating about this, if you compare this to the police, right? In 1922, 29% of teachers were Japanese. By 1932, it was 30%, but by 1938, it was 44%. So whereas the percentage of police will stay about the same, in the percentage of Japanese school teachers, and thus will go up, while the percentage of Korean school teachers will go down, right? Because the Japanese want to control the Korean students more, and they don't trust Korean teachers. And to give you an idea of how, even though they would say, well, we built schools or something like this, by the 1930s, only 1 out of every 6 elementary age children were actually in schools recognized by the Japanese government. So there is some development in modernity, but it's important to recognize that the Koreans paid for it. And as I've tried to stress, and I think education is the best example, Koreans were expected to develop in accordance with Japanese needs, not in accordance with Korean needs. Koreans were supposed to be second to Japanese. And this is, again, why this is such a bitter, in a sense, pill to swallow, why Koreans did not like this system, and why they would resist the Japanese and be very happy once the Japanese were defeated. Though, of course, we always have to remember there were Koreans who did work with the Japanese, particularly in the police, where they beat up and gave a hard time to other Koreans.